Thank you, Nick, and thanks, Connor, for the overview there of the Greater Manchester situation. So yeah, I'd like to talk about the research we've been doing at the University of Salford on the trial in Salford. Before doing that and talking about some of the findings, and I'll be joined by Luke and Harrie shortly in doing that, I'd like to touch on the context, because we think that's quite important. Connor said quite a lot there about the GM policy context. At the time this was launched was October last year, so we were in we weren't in lockdown as such, but we were under COVID-19 restrictions. Our research, this first stage of the research, was conducted in March, and people were then under lockdown in the UK. People were under a stay-at-home order. A lot of people working from home, doing education from home, and places like shops, restaurants, cafes, and so on were mostly closed. What this means is it's a really interesting time to do transport research, because people weren't leaving their homes very much and they had hardly any reason to travel. So in a way, it gives us a kind of baseline. It gives us a sort of sense of, if we take people out of their kind of day-to-day routines of commuting and ask them to imagine how they might travel, it's actually a really interesting stage at which to do travel research, and it kind of gives us a kind of baseline on which to build as the restrictions are relaxed and we see more people using e-scooters. And in the top right there, you can see that the Deansgate in Manchester, was closed to general traffic, and so that people could walk and cycle on it. So there was actually quite a growth in walking and cycling during the lockdown period, and a lot of policy interest in it. And we might position e-scooters somewhere with those modes, and see that people could be using them for fun and recreation during lockdown. The history is quite important here, and Greater Manchester had a bike share scheme, so another micromobility scheme, a few years ago, run by Mobike. When Mobike left Greater Manchester, they were here for approximately a year. When they left Greater Manchester, they cited concerns over theft, vandalism, and antisocial behaviour. And I think there's been quite a bit of media reporting around that as well. So in the public imagination, there is still a memory of a micromobility share scheme where there were problems with those issues, and things like, you know, the bikes being left on pavements in the way and so on. So we sort of take that into account, that there is a memory of that, and people's views of and expectations of e-scooters are likely to be coloured by that, which we have in fact found. Also, we're looking at the official share scheme that's part of the UK government trials, which is happening in 50 or so cities around, or towns and cities around the UK. In Greater Manchester, there are also privately owned e-scooters. Now, these aren't actually legal, but they are being used on roads and pavements across Greater Manchester. So that's separate from what we're looking at. However, when we speak to people about their experiences and perceptions of e-scooters, we can't expect them to differentiate in their mind exactly which type of scooter they saw or were affected by, unless perhaps they were using it. But when we've talked to people about their perceptions that there are e-scooters speeding on the pavements and so on, we can't differentiate those modes. To further complicate that, there is a company in Greater Manchester that is renting out e-scooters on a kind of per day or longer term basis. They're not part of the official UK trials, but they are hiring out e-scooters, so that's confused things even more. They do say on their website that it's not legal to use these scooters, but they are being used around Greater Manchester as well. And just finally, in terms of context, when we did the bike share research, we were looking at bike share rather than cycling, because cycling was already established and it was something quite separate. With this, we're really looking at e-scooters as a whole, because the whole thing is quite new, whether it's e-scooter use or e-scooter sharing. So we're looking at that as a whole when we're speaking to people. And a bit like a share scheme versus private ownership, we don't expect people to necessarily differentiate between sharing and owning e-scooters in the same way they might do with cycling. As Connor explained about the size of the scheme, and it's worth noting, when we did this research in March, this first stage, the scheme was quite compact, and it was mostly around, well, it was entirely around Media City UK and the University of Salford campus, so it was a very specific route between two specific sites. So that, bearing in mind that and the lockdown context, we tended to ask people a lot about how they envisaged themselves using e-scooters, as well as how they did use them. So what we did was we've and throughout this year, we're doing a process of combining reference groups, online surveys, and interviews in an iterative process that feed into each other. We had so far a set of 6 reference groups from different parts of the community, 11 interviews with people who do and do not use e-scooters, an online survey promoted through social media, which received 741 responses. And what we have today then is an interim analysis where we've started, and I think we're just at the surface of looking at all this data and generating more data. And we're really keen to share this with you and also to hear your thoughts on what this means and what the next steps are. In presenting our research, we divide our survey respondents into users, deciders, and avoiders. Users have used an e-scooter. Deciders haven't, but are open to the idea or say they might do. Avoiders haven't and say they are unlikely to use an e-scooter. If we look at how these range across the different social groups, one trend that becomes quite clear is with age. And younger people are more likely to say they have used an e-scooter and more likely to say they are open to the idea of using an e-scooter than older people. On the right-hand side, we look at the types of modes that people use as part of their regular journeys. So people who commonly cycle or drive as part of their routine are less likely to say they've used an e-scooter than those who use neither. And that could be positive in the sense that it could be showing that the e-scooters are enabling people to make journeys that they might otherwise not have been able to make. We asked people, and I was going to blank out some of these and do an animation, but it wouldn't let me. But on the left-hand side here, you can see when we asked people how do they envisage themselves using e-scooters, the most common answer was fun or recreation and curiosity. And I think that reflects the newness of this scheme and also the lockdown context. In the middle, when we asked people why they have actually used it, so those people who have actually used an e-scooter so far, fun and recreation and curiosity are more dominant, as would be expected. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the course of the year. If we look at gender, and this is something we want to unpack through this research, we can see here that that the male respondents were more likely to identify what we might call utility journeys, so going somewhere, going from A to B, whereas the female respondents were more likely to identify the fun or recreational curiosity. So we'd really like to explore why that might be the case. We also asked people whether they were replacing another mode of transport, and as you can see here, walking is the dominant choice here, which might well be expected given the newness and also the lockdown context. And I'm going to hand over to Luke to explain more about some of these interviews.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. When we were doing this research, we were really keen to try and get an understanding of the relationship between e-scooters and other modes of transport. I think Connor touched on this a little bit earlier as well as a really important part of the national trials, to see sort of how e-scooters really fit within the wider systems in place, not only simply infrastructure, but also looking at sort of utility journeys, recreation, and exploring these different journey types. One of the things we found was that quite a few participants drew comparisons between e-scooting and cycling in terms of what it can contribute to utility journeys, recreation. As Graeme was saying, one of the sort of most popular reasons for using e-scooters so far in our research is around that sort of fun and curiosity aspect. So recreation seems to be one of the big sort of motivational factors for people trying out e-scooters for the first time. But we're also keen to try and understand sort of potential journey types for the scooters and what kind of infrastructure needs they need if they are going to become more sort of a part of our everyday experience on the roads. What we found was that a lot of participants sort of could see themselves using the e-scooters and can see the e-scooters fulfilling a similar role to, let's say, cycling, but they observed that e-scooters potentially have lower health benefits. I think, you know, the definition of e-scooters as active travel, I think, is, you know, it's one that's still being debated. Whether or not the health benefits to e-scooting versus cycling are the same, or and what the differences are, I think research will go on to sort of shed some light on. But people are already starting to notice that, you know, if they want to take some form of active travel for whatever their journey might be, then they notice that e-scooters might not necessarily give them that. And interestingly, sort of some, you know, going into a little bit more detail, for some people, the sort of standing position of the e-scooter was a benefit, really. It was one of the things that attracted them to using the mode, and it led to increased feelings of safety. Some people were saying that they felt more secure on an e-scooter because of the standing position than they did on a bicycle due to the seated position. And one of the reasons was that because the e-scooters are closer to the ground. So they said if something was to go wrong, because I'm standing up, I can simply step off the scooter and protect myself. Whereas when I'm on a bike, I don't feel as though I have that freedom to get off it as quickly or in a safer way. So people were drawing these sort of interesting comparisons around safety. And there's just a couple of quotes there at the bottom from the survey and one of the interviews from someone saying I think I'd find it more comfortable than a bike, and that they're looking forward to try one. So this was talking to someone who was asking them about how they could see themselves using the scooters. And from one of the interviews, someone said that, they think there's a lot less that could go wrong on a scooter than if you're on a road bike. And this sort of came back to that idea of a low ground clearance and being able to get off the vehicle quicker if something was to go wrong. But it wasn't all sort of one-sided. There was also a perception of this perception of comparative safety wasn't shared by everyone. One survey comment came in that said they wouldn't use the e-scooters because when compared to a bike, they seem much less safe. And interestingly, digging deeper into that, that was for the same reason as one of the participants finding that e-scooters felt safe, was that they actually thought the low ground clearance actually led them to feeling quite unsafe on the scooters. So again, this is quite a complex issue for a lot of people, this feeling of safety and the perception of safety when on the vehicles. And something that's come out of the research so far is this idea that people who have a greater experience of cycling seem to have a greater confidence using e-scooters on the road. This was mentioned by one participant who said his experience of cycling aided his ability to keep balance and read the road, anticipate potholes or speed bumps and things like that, because from his cycling experience, he's used to navigating these spaces. And so he was able to easily transfer that to using an e-scooter. But for someone who maybe doesn't cycle and is using an e-scooter for the first time, these skills that become hardwired over time may not necessarily be there, leading again to feelings of a lack of safety on the roads. I'll pass over back to Graeme.
Thanks, Luke. So in the survey, we also asked people what factors they thought would limit how much they use e-scooters. And I'm going through these fairly fast, but you can read and you can download the report and read these in more detail. As you can see, the concern about road safety is prominent here, as is concern about crime and antisocial behaviour. This is probably very familiar to anyone involved with cycling research. This is the big barrier, really, is feeling of safety. And it's also clear from the graph on the right-hand side that amongst our respondents, female respondents were much more likely to express concern about this. They were also more likely to express concern about not knowing which routes to take, which can be associated with safety, and not having a helmet available, as well as not knowing how to use an e-scooter. All of those I would associate with safety to some extent. If we look at the way this is divided across the different user types, we can see that, so I just lost my screen for a moment. We can see that avoiders are more likely to say that they're concerned about road safety, whereas users are less likely. This implies to me that that's one of the factors that's stopping people moving from being an avoider, a decider, or a user, and that corresponds to several other items of the concerns on there. And back to Luke. We also asked people what they were concerned about, just in a more general sense, not just about their use, but about e-scooters generally. And it is clear that there was some concern about scooters being ridden irresponsibly. That's our words in the survey, not their words. And also concern about vandalism and to some extent making pavements unsafe. So I'm expanding on some of those issues now. I will hand back to Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. I'm going to touch on the geofence a little bit. I know Connor talked about this earlier and Graeme mentioned it at the beginning as well, but I think a really important thing to talk about, particularly when we're talking about sort of micro-mobility share schemes, the geofence or the area of operation, really important because they're effectively the area in which you can use the vehicles. So they're quite essential in terms of getting that right. From what you can see on the map, the orange section of it represents what was phase 1 and 2. Phase 1 was initially the University of Salford campus, which is the sort of the big chunk at the top in orange. And then phase 2 opened up Media City, which is the bottom orange chunk to the sort of left-hand side, connected with one road connecting the two sites. And so this is where our research so far has taken place, looking at phase 1 and 2, the scooters being available on the University of Salford campus and Media City campus, and the ability to connect between the two. And phase 3 is what you can see in blue. As you can see, it's a much bigger area across much more of Salford, and gives people the chance to access many new kinds of areas. From what we found in our research, I said the geofence is important, and when you have an area of operation that is somewhat quite limited, that naturally lends itself to offering limited kinds of journey types for potential users, and that's sort of what we found in our research. I've just put up a quote here who was talking about how the very limited geographical area that the scooters could be used in, then saying they would use them more if the area opened up across Salford and Manchester, which it now has in phase 3. And then there's just a comment sort of about how it would be great if you could use the scooters between Manchester and Salford to give sort of potential users the maximum sort of options available for their different journey types, really. So moving forward for us, we're particularly interested to see how people are now going to look at the bigger geofence in phase 3. And as we collect data over the next few months, we're really curious to see how people are going to be using the scooters in this much bigger space. As Graeme mentioned, road and personal safety is really important. And what we found was that perceptions of safety vary. It's really important for us to note that when we're talking about people feeling unsafe or feeling confident on the roads, we're not saying that e-scooters are dangerous or e-scooters are safe. We're sort of saying that, we're talking about the perceptions from participants that were expressed. And what we found was that quite a few participants expressed concerns about safety when using e-scooters in traffic. This sort of harks back to what I mentioned a few minutes ago about people's potential experience on the roads, whether or not they have experience from cycling or experience from using other kinds of mobility. But we're definitely finding that people that don't have a huge amount of experience, with other active travel modes, tend to find navigating the roads for the first time with e-scooters quite a daunting experience. But we also found that some participants expressed their concerns about safety as pedestrians as well. So while using shared pavements, shared spaces, again, I know Connor touched on this a little bit earlier, but some people expressed concerns about sharing these spaces with e-scooters. One of the things that came up about this perception of personal safety was that e-scooters are quiet, very quiet, and people can be quite wary of not being able to hear them coming. And so that's a potential concern of some people who might be sharing these spaces with them. And there's just a quote there that came out of the survey about a survey comment of a participant's concern about e-scooters potentially being, good vehicles for robberies just because you can't hear them coming. But it's really that element of the quietness of the vehicles that we're sort of pulling out from there, that's not being able to hear them coming can make people feel quite unsafe in these spaces. And building on this, these feelings of safety, some people said that they saw the e-scooters being being able to act as a mobility option that could provide a safe alternative to walking home at night or waiting at public transport interchanges and at various stages of the night. And they saw it as an option that could potentially reduce the risk of harassment or attack upon themselves. So they very much saw e-scooters as a positive in this sense, that it gave them a personal mode of transport mobility to get home safely in times when perhaps they might have to look at alternatives like walking home alone, potentially in the dark, and the feelings of lack of safety that come from that. But also, sort of on the other side of that, some participants expressed concern that e-scooters could be a factor in drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Some people said that, you know, the scooters can be quite brightly coloured. They can look quite, you know, quite cool, quite trendy on the roads. People notice them because they're still quite a new form of mobility. So some people were concerned about using them on the roads and receiving unwanted attention as a result of that. So that was I think that was an interesting point that came up for us during the focus groups and the interviews. Just a quick one on helmets, because I know this is a polarizing topic in the cycling community. But at the moment with the schemes, it is not mandatory to use a helmet while using an e-scooter. And there was quite a few comments that came through sort of on this subject. And as I said, I know it's a polarizing one for many people, but there was one of the first quotes there says, you know, I don't agree with having to wear a helmet when riding an e-scooter, given the relatively low speeds. They think that the helmet could potentially be a barrier to getting new users to try out the scheme, and sends out the wrong message about safety when the focus should be on motor vehicles. So that was one element. But then, as you can see with the following quote, we also had someone who said they think the helmet must be made mandatory for both cyclists and e-scooter users, sort of citing their experiences of cyclists who don't wear helmets on cycle lanes, and are concerned that e-scooters could potentially go down the same way. So again, the helmet debate has not gone away, still very much alive in regards to e-scooters. Yeah, social inclusion is also came up as a really important point. We found that younger people are more likely to have used e-scooters in the trial so far, and trends in our data suggest that women are less likely to use the scooters for journeys from A to B, as Graeme touched on earlier. They seem much more likely to be using them out of the fun and curiosity. And just to comment on the national schemes which Salford fall into, but you need to be over 18 years old and have at least a provisional driving licence to access the scheme, which could potentially be a barrier to some. You also need a smartphone to access the app and the ability to have data to download the Lime app to access it. Lime has developed appless technology, which they're rolling out in the States, but it's not currently in the UK yet because for multiple reasons, the DFT decided that the smartphone app approach was the best way to go in terms of the trials, but the appless technology is there potentially for the future if Lime decided to roll it out in the UK. And cost was seen to be relative across participants. Some people who cycled regularly were more likely to find the price of e-scooters expensive compared to other participants who perhaps pay for public transport services and found the e-scooters to be reasonably priced. So again, cost in many ways across micromobilities is, you know, can often be relative.
Oh, Harrie, would you like to talk about the reference groups now, and then we'll conclude?
Yeah, I would. My video sharing isn't working, so I'll leave that off. So as part of the research, we also did reference groups. So we did a few of these. So I'll talk quickly about the vulnerable users reference group and the women's reference group. The vulnerable users reference group, in this, we were talking to an array of people. One of them was a disability reference group with people who were visually impaired, neurodiverse, a whole range of people. So one of the things that we were talking about a lot was the scooters on the pavements. I think one of the biggest concerns within that was that the public perception around scooters was that it was the accident rate. So when people are talking about e-scooters on pavements, the focus is on accidents. And within this group, they were pointing out that it's not just accidents, it's actually the kind of the feeling of having those scooters and the creation of a hostile environment on the. And for a visually impaired person, for example, you can't see what's going on, or for a person that's hard of hearing or deaf, you can't hear what's coming up behind you, and you're creating you're adding to an already quite hostile urban environment and making something even worse. And also the discussion kind of that often comes into it is for a lot of non-disabled people, they will start saying, but what about cars? But there needs to be this recognition that cars are an issue, but e-scooters can be an issue on top of that. And you can't, there's no point kind of saying one is worse than the other when they both kind of pose issues to disabled people. Another one that came out was actually there's potential to think of e-scooters maybe as mobility aids, and this was particularly interesting for multimodal journeys and the potential for first and last miles within those journeys, especially if either you can leave the e-scooter at a train or tram station or take it with you on the train or tram. And then with the women's reference groups, so we're talking about gender differences in the usage, and people were specific, or women were talking about their observations on who were using scooters. Again, much like cycling, comes down to infrastructure, I think, and that until there's safe and segregated infrastructure, a lot of women won't cycle or won't use e-scooters. And the type of journeys that a lot of women are doing, so women are more likely to be taking kids to school, doing shopping, so thinking about whether and how e-scooters can be used for those. Or I have recently seen an e-scooter with a trailer. So that's quickly just going over those, but if you have any more questions, please ask.
Thank you, Harrie. So just to really quickly wrap up, because I know we're over time, in the rest of this year, we're going to be doing further research on the scheme in Salford, and we're really interested to see how it develops as the scheme now is slightly larger, and also as the restrictions around COVID-19 are lifted. So we're interested in all these things listed here, really. Who's using them, why, for what purpose? Is there a social gradient across age and gender? And is that down to some kind of exclusion that we could look at? What's the relationship with other forms of transport? How can we address these really important questions that Harrie just touched on around vulnerable road users? And the kind of million-dollar question really is, what are the impacts on social inclusion and decarbonisation? Are these creating ways for people to travel in ways they couldn't otherwise, or perhaps more affordably? And are they offering alternatives to the car and therefore reducing carbon emissions? So hopefully we can pick up some of those points in the panel discussion. Thanks very much.